Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final night of our Earth Month webinars in honor of Florida's coral reef. We'll give everyone one more minute to go ahead and join us here today, and I'll start sharing my screen. Okay. So I think, Molly, you just see my full screen now, correct?
Yes, I see the slides and all the notes and everything. And now just the
Perfect. All right, so while we wait for folks to trickle in, I'm going to launch a poll here, and I'm curious where you are joining us from. Are you here in Florida? Are you outside of Florida? Are you near the reef? Where are you? And if you're elsewhere in the United States, I'm super curious where you are. If you want to go ahead and type in the chat and question box. We've got our Coral Reef Conservation Program Assistant Manager, Molly, here with us in the chat box to answer any questions you may have. Oh, a scuba diver from Maryland. Mary, I'm originally from Maryland. Wonderful. Looks like we've got a good mix of folks here. Okay. So my name is Michelle Gralty, and I'm the Awareness and Appreciation Project Coordinator for the Coral Reef Conservation Program. So that pretty much means that I manage all of the education and outreach related projects, including our Earth Month webinars. We did them entirely virtual for the first time last year, and we did them in 1 week, and it was so much fun, but we figured why not extend the fun and do it throughout all of Earth Month. So thank you so much for being a coral champion and joining us here tonight. We're going to be going through the species that we commonly see up here in the northern section of the reef, and of course you'll see them down further in the Keys as well. My coworker Molly, the assistant manager of the coral program, will be in the chat box to answer any questions you may have, since I won't be able to hear you during the webinar, but please go ahead and type your questions away. And then at the end, we will have a quiz. And I've got a few more polls in here sprinkled throughout that we can go through. And to start off, I want to videos showcasing the reef. All right. Okay. Now the trick is navigating out of this video. Okay. Perfect. So now we've got a sense of what Florida's coral reef looks like, but we want to learn more about where on Earth it is. So the reef stretches for over 350 miles, which is like driving from Miami to Jacksonville. So if you're from outside the state or you've ever driven to leave the state, you know how long that is. So it starts up at the St. Lucie Inlet in Martin County, and then it hugs the coast down through West Palm, Fort Lauderdale, me in Miami, down past Key Largo, Key West, and all the way out to the Dry Tortugas, which is about 60 miles west of Key West. Now, if you've ever been to the Dry Tortugas, please let us know in the chat. I am dying to go there, but Molly has been there herself, which I am very jealous of. You'll notice we've got some different colored rectangles along here, and these represent the different management bodies. 350 miles is a lot of area, right? And thankfully, we have a lot of different folks involved in management. So this bright teal area up here from Martin County down to the northern border of Biscayne National Park is the Southeast Florida Coral Reef Ecosystem Conservation Area, or the Coral ECA. So this is the section of the reef that DEP manages. And then below that, you've got this bright green area. This is Biscayne National Park. If you've ever been to Biscayne National Park, go ahead and let us know in the chat. I think this was our nation's first ever underwater park. And then we've got the nation's first ever underwater state park with John Pennekamp down here in Burgundy. And then this big yellow section is Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, which is co-managed by us at DEP and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. And then further out, we've got another national park with Dry Tortugas National Park. So now we're going to learn more about the ins and outs of the reef. So when we're talking about the benthic community, we're talking about the creatures that live on the bottom, the benthos. And these are the four big functional groups that we have in a coral reef community. First up, we've got octo corals, sometimes called soft corals. And they're called octo corals because each polyp has 8 tentacles. Whereas with our stony corals, sometimes that number will vary. And these octo corals will sway in the water column. But our stony corals, those are the rigid ones, quite literally like stones, that cement themselves to the reef. Then we have lots of different kinds of algae, macroalgae, crustose coralline algae, and then we've got sponges, which are also animals, which my middle school self was very surprised to learn many years ago. So I'm going to walk you all through these 4 different groups we've got here. First up is those soft or those octo corals. So there are over 60 species of octo corals in Southeast Florida. We've got about 43 stony coral species, so they outnumber our stony corals, both in diversity, density, and even on cover out on the reef. Here we've got some sea fans on the far left and some sea plumes on the right there. And now when we look very closely, we can count these tentacles here. So we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 there. Next up is our sponges, which are also animals just like our corals. So there are over 200 kinds of sponges identified in Southeast Florida, which again outnumbers our stony coral friends. And they also outnumber stony corals in cover and density as well. My personal favorite is the giant barrel sponge, which we see on the right here. Got some more great sponge photos here. So we won't be doing sponge ID today, but we'll be focusing on stony corals. Next up, we've got those algae that I was telling you about, and we've got different kinds. We have macroalgae and turf algae. This kind of algae has increased over the last few years on Southeast Florida's reefs. And these tend to be the species when we're talking about algal blooms as well. But there is a special kind of algae, crustose coralline algae, that's really good for corals. It encourages the settlement of the coral larvae or the coral babies that are floating in the water column. So these coral babies, when they're trying to find a spot on the reef to settle, they're looking for just the right amount of crustose coralline algae. So we see when we have folks on land raising corals in aquariums, they want to make sure that they have crustose coralline algae in there as well for their baby corals. We can see here we've got some algae overgrowing corals here, more of that macro and terp algae here. Now, before we get into the stony corals themselves, we also want to make sure we're identifying what are not stony corals. So we went through those sponges and the soft corals, which can be easy to confuse with stony corals. Thankfully, the algae tend to look a bit fuzzier than our stony corals, but this one's always a tricky one. This is fire coral, which is usually bright orange in color and can look pretty stony, but it is actually not a stony coral. And you want to be very careful if you ever see fire coral, because you don't want to swim over it and brush against it. It will burn you and it will feel like fire. Speaking from experience. Now, corals are animals, which always comes as a shock to the elementary schools that I teach, which is always fun info to share. And they're in the phylum Cnidaria, which is the same as jellyfish. Sometimes I kind of like to think of corals as upside down jellyfish living in a cup. So I've got a model here of a 3D printed coral polyp. You can find this online at NOAA's website. And so the white part represents the calcium carbonate or the limestone skeleton. And you can see that white part has a lot of holes, kind of like Swiss cheese. So it's very porous. So you may hear, oh, Florida's bedrock is very porous with all of the limestone that we have. Right? So that calcium carbonate skeleton, that forms the cup that the living coral tissue then lives in and grows on. So this is kind of like the upside down jellyfish part. And then we've got the tentacles, just like the jellyfish up here. And I was surprised to learn when I started studying corals more closely that these tentacles, just like their jellyfish friends, also have stinging cells in them. So if we're looking at this coral over here on the far left, this is an Elkhorn coral, Acropora palmata. And so it is a stony coral, which is in the order Sclerectinia. And we've got our stony versus soft corals there. Our soft corals being our Octo Corals. So those are the Alcyonaceae. And then moving down with the families, that we've got Acroporids, so that includes our Elkhorn, which look more like this, and our Staghorn, which look more like this. We'll get into those later. And then we've got the species going down from there. So that's our basic coral taxonomy, kind of helping you understand where we are on the phylogenetic tree. Now, when we're identifying corals, it's very helpful to be familiar with their skeletal structure. So with this coral polyp here, the white part represents the coralite or the skeleton. And then this silvery blue part represents the polyp and the living tissue. So tonight we're going to be talking about a few different parts of the coralite here. We're going to be talking about the septa. So those are the different ridges there, which you can see when covered with the tissue. You can see the ridges with the tissue there too. And then we're also going to be talking about the calyx, or the rim of the coral polyp there, the rim of the cup. I like to call it the rim of the volcano there. So that's another key component of polyp ID that we'll be talking about tonight. Oh, perfect. I forgot I had this slide. So we can see that the coralite represents the whole polyp, and then we've got the septa, which are the ridges there, and the mouth right in the middle.
Hey, Michelle, real quick about sizes for the coral polyps. Thought this would be a good time to bring it up, and just mention for your last slide, they are about 1 to 3 millimeters across in size. So give you a better scale.
Perfect. Thanks, Molly. And we're going right into coralite shapes and sizes right here. So I've got a few skeletons with me today too. This shows you all of these photos are coral skeletons. So you can get a nice zoomed in one here. And I actually think that the skeleton I'm holding is the one in the middle there. So this is an example of a star coral. And when you look inside each polyp here, you can see that we've kind of got a radial star pattern going on there. So there are tens of kinds of star corals here in Florida. And although they will look different inside each polyp, you'll see that radial star pattern. And then we've got our brain corals, which look very, very different. They form mounds out on the reef, and you can see we've got those brain-like ridges and valleys. And then we've got our staghorn coral, which is branching. And you can see that these polyps here are protruding from the coral skeleton there. And here is what they look like with living tissue on top. So on the left, we have lettuce coral there encrusting on the reef. In the middle, we've got that star coral. And on the right, we've got, I think that's the smooth flower coral. So we'll go more into each of these later on. And here's another example, again, showing you the different coralite shapes and sizes. So we've got kinds of brain corals on the left and the right. And then in the middle, a flower coral. One very helpful characteristic that will help you with your ID is color. Both of these are in the genus Acropora. We've got our staghorn coral on the left and our Elkhorn coral on the right. And both of these tend to be burnt orange in color. Now, color can vary among the same species. Here we've got Montastria cavernosa, the great star coral. This one always kind of looks like blistery in appearance. And we can see we've got different color variations here. And sometimes, as you can see from the middle photo, the insides of each polyp will actually fluoresce. Now with color, the deeper we go, we start to lose those reds and other colors. You know, so if you ever go down and you don't take a color corrector with you, everything just looks green and blue in your photos. So color can also change among species the deeper that we go in the water. Colony size is another very helpful characteristic with coral ID. Certain species can only grow to be a few inches, whereas other species can grow to be over 5 feet wide. Polyp size is also helpful too. On the left, we've got a solitary coral polyp. That one, correct me, Molly, I think that one can grow to be about 2 inches across. And then with our great star coral there in the middle, those polyps can be maybe the size of your pointer finger thumbnail. And then on the far right, those polyps are maybe a few millimeters across. So as we go through the different species tonight, I'll be talking about the different polyp sizes. Next up, we want to know whether or not the coral is a solitary coral, so it's just one polyp, or it's colonial, meaning that there are multiple polyps connected together. We do not have that many solitary corals here in Florida. Most of them will be colony species. Next up, we've got those coralite calyces that I was talking to you about earlier. So these are the rims of the volcano, the rims of the cup. So the singular is calyx, and then the plural is calyces. So on the far left here, we can see that these calyces are protruding from the coral skeleton. And then in the middle here, we can see that they're kind of flush with the skeleton. And then on the right, it appears like they're sunken. So this is something we'll be reviewing as well. And then when it comes to our brain corals, we're looking at the ridge structure. So when we're looking at that mountain ridge, is there a groove on the top of it? Is it smooth? Is there a groove on top of that ridge that's pretty deep? So this is something we'll be looking at with our brain corals later. Now, all of the photos that we've got here today will be coming from the Reef Coral ID book. This is like my Bible. You can see all of the different Post-it notes and whatnot that I have in here. This is a fabulous book. I highly recommend it if you are interested in learning your Caribbean corals. So before I get into each species, I'll go over the classification group that we'll be going through. We're going to have a quiz at the end, so I definitely recommend writing down either the scientific or the common name or both, and some helpful hints to help you all remember. First up, we're going to go through our flowering and cup corals. Now, these are one of my favorites. This is the smooth flower coral, or Usmelia fastigiata. Now, I remember the scientific name for this one because I think, okay, Usmelia, you smell the flowers, smooth flower coral. So that's how I keep track of this one. Now, this coral can be found in a pretty wide depth range, all the way down to 200 feet. And the colonies can be anywhere from 6 inches to about 2.5 feet wide. And the polyps are usually about 3/4 of an inch to 1.25 inch. And the polyps kind of grow on stalks, like actual flowers that you might have in a bouquet. I always think that each polyp kind of looks like a mouth that you make with your hand, like this. And so you can see that those septa, or the ridges, are very defined there on the smooth flower coral. Next up, we've got leaf, plate, and sheet corals. So these grow in big leaves or plates out on the reef, sometimes in an encrusting type fashion. First up, we've got the lettuce coral, Daria Agricities. Again, these can be found pretty deep as well, all the way up to 200 feet. And the colonies can be anywhere from 4 inches to about 3 feet wide. Usually they're encrusting on the reef, and these are pretty easy to identify because they quite literally look like a leaf of lettuce. Now, the valleys aren't continuous here, and the coralites are actually in all of these valleys here. Next up, we've got the white star sheet coral, Gracia Lamarcki. These will not be on your shallower reefs. You won't see these until you get down to about 65 feet, and then you'll see them down to about 120 feet. Now, these colonies can grow up to be about 6 feet across. So remember, the lettuce coral can be maybe 3 feet across, but these white star sheet corals can be up to 6 feet across. So if you see a big one out there, it's not going to be a lettuce coral. And these tend to have much more of a kind of whorl-like pattern on them. And what's the most helpful ID trick with these is looking for white mouths. So when you look at these two next to each other, we can see the defined white mouths on the left from that white star sheet or white mouth sheet coral. And then we've got the lettuce coral on the right that does not have any white mouths. Next up for our leaf plate and sheet corals, we've got the fragile saucer coral, Agricities fragilis. These can be found anywhere from 20 to 180 feet, and these colonies are much smaller. They're not going to be more than 6 inches in diameter. So that's how you can tell them apart from the lettuce coral. Next up, we're going to go through 5 species of branching and pillar corals. First up, we've got the Staghorn Coral, Acropora cervicornis. These tend to grow in big thickets and look like deer antler racks. Now, their cylindrical branches are pretty narrow, maybe a bit thicker than your fingers, maybe like your thumb, perhaps. And like I said, they like to grow in thickets and can be found anywhere from 1 foot to about 160 feet deep. Now you'll notice on this picture here, there are some white tips on these staghorn corals. Sometimes people confuse this with coral bleaching, but our staghorn and elkhorn corals, our acroporids, are the fastest growing species that we have here in Florida. So what happens is the skeleton grows faster than the colorful zooxanthellae can jump into the tissues and give them color. So those white tips are actually growth points. Oh, I love these photos. Here we've got some baby staghorn corals. And on the right, again, you can see a lot of those growth points. Next up, we've got our elkhorn coral. Now notice, staghorn coral can be found up to 160 feet deep, but elkhorn are not found that deep. They usually max out at about 55 feet. And these have much flatter branches. So if you're trying to work on your scientific names, I think Acropora palmata, palm flat, like the palm of my hand, elkhorn coral. And these also tend to grow in thickets as well. Now, bonus points, can anyone identify that fish that's swimming in front of that photo? Go ahead and type it in the chat. Yellowtail snapper. Yes, good job, everyone. Awesome. And that leads me to my next poll, which is, did you join any of our previous Earth Month webinars? Ooh, we've got some coral champions in the house tonight, tuning into more than one. That's wonderful. Great. Okay, let's see if I've got another elkhorn photo here. Oh, and I do, wonderful. You can see they both have that burnt orange color with these acroporids. Next up is the pillar coral, Dendrogyra cylindress. Now, if you have ever seen a pillar coral in the wild, please go ahead and throw it in the chat. These are very, very rare outside of the Tortugas nowadays. They're a bit shallower, about 4 to 65 feet, and these pillars can grow anywhere from 4 to 10 feet off of the reef, which is amazing. Now, unlike the staghorn coral, which is a branching species, right, that has those more narrow branches, the pillars on pillar corals are usually about 3 to 5 inches in diameter, so they are much thicker. I always think they kind of look like Dr. Seuss characters. Looks like something out of the Lorax, all fuzzy. When their polyps are extended, they look very fuzzy, and sometimes people like to describe them as charismatic corals. Here we've got a baby pillar coral. You can see it's encrusting on the reef there and then starting to grow up. Next up on our branching corals, we've got finger corals. So Porites, and Porites divaricata. These can be a little tough to tell apart. They can be found pretty deep as well, up to 160 feet deep. And their colonies will usually be no bigger than 4 feet in diameter. So all finger corals have smooth branches, but they vary in diameter. So Porites on the far right here, they have stout, blunt branches. The tips of Porites kind of look like clubs, whereas with Porites divaricata, they grow much thinner, widely spaced branches. So to tell these apart, I think divaricata divide, spaced apart. Finally, next up we've got my favorite classification group, the brain corals. I just think these ones are so neat. So first up, we've got the Boulder brain coral, Copophilia Natanz. Now, these can be found pretty deep, anywhere from 2 feet to 175 feet. And Molly, correct me if I'm wrong, but boulder brain corals are the biggest brain coral species that we have. They form really large domes. And when we look at their ridges at the top, we can see we've got a round ridge and there's a thin, distinct groove that runs along the top of the ridge and then halfway down the ridge as well. So when we're looking for boulder brain coral, Copophilia natans, we want to see that line at the top and then that line halfway down. Ooh, then we've got the mouths there of each coralite. Symmetrical brain coral. These can grow very big as well, up to 6 feet in diameter, not quite as big as our boulder brain coral. And these can also be found very deep too, up to 130 feet deep. And their scientific name is Pseudo-Diploia Strugosa. And I am able to remember the scientific name because when you're looking at the whole colony, if you look at the edges, you'll see that the ridges start to run in parallel at the edge of the colony. So I think, okay, Stragosa, straight lines together. Pseudo-Diploia Strugosa. Now, when we look closely at these ridges here, we can see they don't really have that defined line at the top. So, in looking at these, on the far right, we've got our Copophilia natans, the boulder brain coral. We can see the line at the top of the ridge and the line halfway down. And then we've got the symmetrical brain coral on the left, Pseudo-Diploia Strugosa, because we don't see those defined ridge lines or grooves. Oh, great. Here's a photo showing how those ridges start to run kind of in parallel at the base of the colony. Next up, I always think this one looks so silly. I think it looks like something out of Lord of the Rings. This is the knobby brain coral, Pseudo-Diploia clavosa. Now, to remember the scientific name for this one, I think, oh, that brain coral looks kind of clumpy. Clumpy clavosa. Again, these can be found pretty deep, up to 135 feet, but they won't get too big. The colonies won't grow to be any more than 4 feet in diameter. So again, with these, you're going to be looking for those knobs all over the brain coral.
One more thing to add on this one is if you see a brain coral with a lot of those Christmas tree worms, the little fan worms that flutter away if they notice you're nearby, those really tend to like the knobby brain coral. So if you see a lot of them, it's most likely a knobby brain coral.
Ooh, darn, I should put a Christmas tree worm photo in here. Okay, and so now we can see, again, we've got those ridges that don't really have a groove at the top. Very clumpy clavosa. Oh, I didn't realize I put this many pictures, this one in here, that's great. All right, we've got another bonus fish. Who is that little fella on the left there? I'll give you a hint, it is a kind of wrasse. Bluehead wrasse, awesome job, everyone. Okay, next up we've got my favorite of the favorites, the grooved brain coral, Diploria Labyrinthiformis. So I remember this scientific name by thinking, okay, if it's grooved, that means it's got even more ridges than normal. So it's kind of like a labyrinth, right? A lot of interwoven stuff. Diploria Labyrinthiformis. Again, the grooved brain coral can be found pretty deep. All of our brain corals can. And this one doesn't get as big as the boulder brain coral or the symmetrical brain coral. Similar to the knobby brain coral, it'll grow to be about 4 feet in diameter. And when we look closely, we can see this double ridge at the top. So it kind of looks like you took your thumb and you ran it across a stick of butter and created that ridge. So on the left here, we've got a baby grooved brain coral, which is just so cute. And then we've got a zoom in there on the right of the grooved ridge. Now this one is really neat. This is the maze coral, which I think looks like a bunch of zippers, and the scientific name is Meandrina meandrites. This scientific name is a bit easier to remember because of the alliteration, maze, Meandrina meandrites. Now this coral can be found pretty deep, up to 240 feet deep. They don't get incredibly large, maybe about 3 feet in diameter. And they're usually encrusting on the reef. So we can see that their septa look really serrated. So these don't look like the other brain corals that we were looking at, right? All of their septa, or those ridges we were talking about, are very defined and separated. I kind of compare this one to like if you were making a fire with firewood and you were stacking all the firewood up together, that's what these ridges look like. And we can see some pretty neat color variations in this one sometimes as well. All right, next up we've got a handful of species, the encrusting, the mound, and the boulder corals. So this will include our star coral friends. First up, we've got the 10-ray star coral. Molly, can you correct my pronunciation on this one? I always say Madracus decactus, but I don't think that's correct.
I always say Madracis. But okay. I think all scientific naming is very subjective to if you're reading it and say it before.
I did not take Latin in high school.
I feel like I pronounced most of them wrong, but as long as you say it with confidence.
The 10-ray star coral is what we shall call it. So these colonies are very small. They may grow to be up to 6 inches in diameter, and they've got really tiny protruding coralites. There we can see the coralites are clearly defined, and the tentacles are kind of extended on that photo. Now, if we look closely and we count, we should be able to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 septa there. So that's where it gets its name, the 10-ray star coral. Next up, we've got the blushing star coral, Stefanocenia Interceptor. So to remember this scientific name, I always think, okay, if you're blushing, that means you're hiding from something, intercept something, interfering, something's interfering with you, so you're blushing. I don't know, it makes sense in my head. It might work for you, might not. Stefanocenia Interceptor. Now it gets its name because when approached, the coral will quite literally blush or change color. So that when the polyps retract, then you see a dark border around the coralite appear, so the color changes. These colonies don't grow too big, maybe up to 2.5 feet in diameter. And these boulders are always going to appear pretty smooth as well. Next up, we've got the smooth star coral, Solanastria bournoni. Now this one looks a bit clumpier, as you can see, than the blushing star coral. And this one isn't found too deep, maybe 5 feet to 60 feet deep. And the colonies won't be more than 1.5 feet across. You can see we kind of got those irregular domes forming, and the coralites are protruding a little bit from the skeleton. Whereas with our blushing star coral, you can see the coralites are really kind of flush with the skeleton there. So that is our smooth star. There we go. You can see the coralites protruding a bit there. Oh, I love this one. This is elliptical star coral, Dichosenia stokesi. This one can be found very deep. I've seen it on some wrecks, like at about 130 feet down. This one can be found up to 225 feet deep. Now, I often think that this looks like the smooth flower coral that we saw earlier, because those septa are really defined, and they kind of, and the coralites are kind of making this shape. But unlike the smooth flower coral that kind of grows on those stalks, This one is growing in a ball, in a dome or a plate. And so we've got no stalks, and the each coralite is kind of more smushed together. There we can see a bit more of a plate version of it. I just think these photos are so funny. I think they look like little teeth. Next up, we've got the golf ball coral, Favia fragum. This one sometimes can be confused with the elliptical star coral, but look at the septa here. They're much more clearly defined on the elliptical star coral, whereas with Favia fragum, they're not as defined clearly, and these look even more smushed together. And the colony size will be a big giveaway as well. So with the elliptical star coral, this can be anywhere up to 15 inches across, but with Favia fragum, it's much smaller, quite literally a golf ball. And these are usually a fun yellow color as well. Next up, we've got the great star coral, Montastria cavernosa. So that is this skeleton that I showed you earlier. These can be found very deep, up to 300 feet deep. So that, I think, is the deepest species we've gone through today so far. And these colonies can grow to be absolutely massive as well. These are one of my favorites to see out on the reef because the polyps, they have that very blistered appearance, so they look really puffy to me. I think they're quite fun. And these are the ones that can also have the insides of each polyp fluorescing as well. Oh, there they are. So you can see they look pretty puffy there. And on the bottom, that's what it looks like when the polyps are extended. Oh, we've got a baby there. Oh my goodness, I didn't know I put this many great star coral photos in here. Okay, next up we've got the mountainous star coral, Orbicella faviolata. Now this species is listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. So the Endangered Species Act has two big classifications. When a species is endangered, that means it's at risk of extinction throughout all of its habitat ranges. But when a species is threatened, that means it's at risk of extinction in only some of its habitat ranges. Now, the mountainous star coral can grow in big boulders up to 10 feet, and they can be found pretty deep as well, up to 130 feet deep. And these polyps are much smaller. Now, when we're telling the difference between, I should have put a better picture there. When we're telling the difference between the great star coral and the mountainous star coral, with the mountainous star coral, we're going to be looking for kind of golf ball size clumps running down the colony in parallel. So it's pretty easy to see those lines of parallel clumps on this colony here. And then when we get deeper, Orbicella faviolata will tend to grow more in a plate or a sheet-like form. But we can see even when this morphology changes, we still see those kind of golf ball-like ridges running in parallel down these plates and sheets here. And we can see these polyps are much more kind of conical looking, whereas the great star coral looks more puffy and blistered. These are much more conical and smaller polyps as well. Oh, perfect. This shows kind of that parallel golf ball formation really well. Next up, we've got the lobed star coral, Orbicella annularis. This is also a threatened species. I always think this one looks like a lump of potatoes. So it quite literally grows in lobes here. And sometimes these stalks, kind of like that smooth flower coral, aren't even connected to one another with living tissue. We can see we've got some bare coral skeleton there connecting these different lobes of Orbicella annularis. And again, these can grow pretty big as well. So with the great star coral, we're looking for those blistered puffy polyps. With the mountainous star coral, we're looking for those parallel mountain ridges, kind of like golf ball shapes. And then with the lobe star coral, we're looking for the lobes, or as I like to call them, the potatoes. Next, we've got the Boulder star coral, Orbicella franksi. Molly can correct me, I think there should be an extra I there in franksi. Again, these can be found pretty deep, up to 130 feet deep, and grow pretty big, up to 10 feet. Now, similar to our knobby brain coral, Pseudo-Diploia Strugosa, Boulder star coral, Orbicella franksi, looks very clumpy, and that's going to be the giveaway with this one here, looking even more clumpy than the mountainous star coral. And some of these clumps on the Boulder star coral are going to look white. Now, they're not bleached, they just don't have any zooxanthellae in them. So when we look at these three Orbicella species all next to each other, again, these are all threatened species. We can see we've got the Orbicella annularis on the top left there, looking like lumpy potatoes. That's our lobed star coral. We can see those defined lobes. Then down here at the bottom, we've got Orbicella fabulata, looking for those parallel mountain ridges on our mountainous star coral growing down there, and then Orbicella franksi on the right. You can see we've got the clumps there. And from this photo too, you can see pretty some of those parts that are azooxanthellae, that don't have any zooxanthellae. Does anyone have any questions about telling these ones apart? And in the meantime, I'm going to launch another poll. Have you ever snorkeled or gone scuba diving on Florida's coral reef? Great, looks like we've got some people who've made it down there and some people who are planning their trip. That's great. All right. We're going to continue on with our encrusting corals here with the mustard hill coral, which quite literally looks like squeezing a bottle of mustard all over the reef. This is Porites asteroides, and this can be found pretty deep as well, up to 160 feet deep. And the colonies will grow to be about 2 feet in diameter, and they look very lumpy as well. And we can see that these coralites here are very small, and they're pretty flush as well. Next up, we've got the massive starlet coral, Siderastria siderea. This one is very common here in Southeast Florida. Sometimes we jokingly call it a weedy coral because it grows like a weed, regardless of environmental conditions. And this can be found very deep as well, up to 220 feet deep and about 6 feet in diameter. Now, these coralites are really neat because they kind of look sunken in here. So with the massive starlet coral, Siderastria siderea, you're going to be looking for those sunken coralites. Here we've got a big colony. Now, when we're talking about massive corals, we're talking about corals that are at least 5 feet in diameter. Next up, we've got the lesser starlet coral, Siderastria radians. Now, I want you to look closely at these coralite structures. They're not perfect circles, unlike the massive starlet coral. Those look a bit more circular. I always think that Siderastria radians, they kind of look pinched, almost a little bit like a diamond shape. And these are going to be these coralites are going to be sunken as well, and they tend to appear even darker than our massive starlit coral here. And the lesser starlit coral also tends to be lighter in color as well. Lesser, lighter. So when we look here with the massive starlit coral on the left and then the lesser on the right, we can see that coralite shape is a little different and a little bit smaller too. So before we get into our quiz, I want to share with you all a bit of information about CFAN. So I'm going to launch another poll here. Have you heard of our Leechwatch Observer Network? Great. So up here in the Coral ECA, so north of Biscayne National Park, all the way up to Martin County, we have a special citizen science program called the Southeast Florida Action Network, or CFAN. So basically, if you're ever out in the water and you see a marine incident, whether it's coral bleaching, algae bloom, big chunks of marine debris, we want to know about it. So that way we can coordinate a response. So you can submit a CFAN report at seafan.net. And then within CFAN, we've got a really neat program called Bleach Watch. So Bleach Watch trains folks to identify coral bleaching and then submit reports to us. So DEP manages that northern 105 miles of reef, which is a lot. And we can't be out there every single day. So we rely on members of the public like you to let us know whenever something is awry out on the reef. So a Bleach Watch training is a free 2-hour class where we teach you how to identify coral bleaching and coral disease and submit reports. And then during the bleaching season from June to November, we send out monthly, sometimes weekly, depending on the conditions, current conditions reports, letting you know where the water is going to be pretty hot and where we might need some extra folks in the water keeping an eye on things. So if you enjoyed today, I definitely encourage you to check out cfan.net and the Bleach Watch program. So I want to thank everyone here who helped build this PowerPoint over the years and all of the different photos. And so now we are ready for our quiz.
Hey, Michelle.
Yep.
We did have one question of how can you tell the Boulder star? If maybe you want to click back to that slide real quick and 3 different ones.
Sure. So the Boulder star coral is going to be our clumpy star coral growing. So it will grow like a boulder, but it's going to have clumps on it. And many of those clumps will have white parts on them that are missing zooxanthellae. So when we look here, we can see Orbicella faviolata. It does have what look like clumps, but they're much more organized in fashion. They're kind of bigger golf ball-like formations that run in parallel down the colony. Whereas with Orbicella franxi, the Boulder star coral, there's not going to be any method to the madness there. It's just going to appear clumpy overall, and you'll have some white parts there.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I want to launch our last, actually, I'll wait to launch that poll. We'll wait till the end. Okay, so for this quiz, I think I've got maybe 15 species. So if you want to go ahead, oh, that's right. Look at me, forgetting what I put in here. So I definitely encourage all of you to check out Florida's coralreef.org. That's where we include information about all the work that our wonderful partners are doing, how you can get involved, get on our email list, and we've got a great news and update section there as well with a lot of original blog content. And now we will go into the quiz. So like I said, I think I've got maybe 15 or 16 species here. So what we'll do, I'll go ahead and click to the slide, give you all a few seconds to think about it, and then I'll give you the answer. So first up, go ahead and have a look. And if you think you know what it is, go ahead and type it in the chat box. So I'll give you a hint. This is a kind of star coral. So this is Solanastria siderea, the massive starlet coral. Here we can see those relatively circular coralites that appear kind of sunken. All right, who do we have here? I'll give you a hint. This is another star coral. Good, Chuck, that's right. This is Montastria cavernosa, the great star coral. This is the one that has those kind of blister-like puffy polyps. Next up, this is a kind of encrusting coral. Now this is one where color can be a helpful ID characteristic. Good. This is the mustard hill coral, Parites asteroides. Okay, who do we have here? This is another kind of star coral. So this is the blushing star coral, Stefanocenia Interceptor. This is the one where the polyps retract, it changes color. So this is a species that's listed under the Endangered Species Act. Good, this is our staghorn coral, Acropora cervicornis. All right, here we've got a brain coral. So we've got some different photos here to show you different characteristics of it. And I'll give you a hint. This is the largest of the brain corals. So this is the Boulder brain coral. This is Copophilia Natanz. And we're looking for that line at the top of the ridge and then that line halfway down. Good, this is lettuce coral. So this is one of those leaf plate and sheet corals that we learned today, Daria Agricities. So here we've got another kind of brain coral. Who could this be? Good, this is the knobby brain coral, Pseudo-Diploia clavosa. Remember, you can think clavosa, clumpy. Here's another one listed under the Endangered Species Act. We can see we've got more of those blue head wrasse swimming in the background. Good. This is our Elkhorn coral, Acropora palmata. Now, our acroporids grow really fast here in Florida. They can grow up to 10 inches per year. Whereas our other kind of encrusting and mounding corals, they'll maybe grow 2 inches per year. Now with this coral, the scientific name and the common name both start with the same letter. Good. This is maize coral, Meandrina meandrites. Kind of looks like zippers, right? With those pieces of firewood stacked up together. Okay, who do we have here? This is a kind of star coral. This is our smooth star coral, Solanastria bornoni. Good job, Chuck. This one's tricky. Another brain coral, my personal favorite. Good. This is the grooved brain coral, Diploria Labyrinthiformis. So we can see we've got that deep groove at the top, like you just ran your thumb across a stick of butter. Here's another one also listed under the Endangered Species Act. One of our branching corals. Good. This is pillar coral, Dendrogyra Cylindress. Who are these? So we've got some different species here, so just go for the common name for this one. Good, these are our finger corals. Yep, we've got Porites debarcata on the left and Porites on the right. So this one looks like our smooth flower coral, but it is not. This is our elliptical star coral. Good, Digoxenia stochesi. And with this one, we've got those really defined septa, but it doesn't grow on those stalks the way our smooth flower coral does. Oh, darn, I thought I had a bonus star coral question. But in the meantime, you can enjoy this lovely picture of a pufferfish. So I'm going to launch one more poll for you all. I'm curious, how do you feel now about your coral ID abilities? Wonderful. Oh, that's great. Okay, so before I leave you all today, I want to ask, what is your favorite coral species, either one that you learned about today or one overall? I really like the pillar corals, even though I've never seen one before. And then my second favorite would probably be the grooved brain coral. Ooh, I do like elliptical star coral too. That's a good one. Great. Well, before I go, if you have any questions, please go ahead and throw them in the chat. All of these webinars from Earth Month were recorded, so we're in the process of uploading them to Friends of Our Florida Reefs YouTube, and they'll be linked on our DEP website, which had all of the information about this Earth Month webinar series. So I want to thank you all so much for joining me this evening, and I hope you learned at least one more species to identify out on Florida's coral reef. Okay, I see Michael was asking, are there any types of coral, soft or hard, that can live below where light reaches? Yes, Michael, there are. Yeah, well, let's see. In flower garden banks, I think the light technically does reach the ones down there, but there are some species that can live with very little light. All right, thanks so much, everyone. I hope that, oh, we've got another one. Thomas asked, do all coral species spawn at the same time? No, but a singular species will spawn at the same time. So Montastria cavernosa, for example, they'll all spawn at once, but that might not be at the same time as a brain coral species. All corals tend to spawn around a full moon in late summer. All right, thanks so much, everyone.